minutes in a
cancelled his trip to Jeju Island.
Whatever.
The
Then
last
that will be
moment,
followed
but
by
still
this
we have,
direction, okay, from
four
Ambassador Nin and all the way down to talk about 3 to 5 minutes.
Let me introduce briefly
and afterwards we
the
can have
panelists
open
from
discussions. Okay? Voila.
on my
자,
left side,
총장 시작하시죠.
Professor Park Jin-hyun. Professor Park is judge of the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea in Hamburg, Germany. He's also dean of the Graduate School of International Studies, Seoul National University, Korea. He has specialized in international law and organization, law of the sea, international security, and conflict management. We have Satu Lumei. Satu Lumei is named director East West Center in Washington in February 2007. He's also a senior advisor at the Center for Naval Analysis Corporation. Immediately prior to his East-West Center appointment, he was a research staff member at the Institute for Defense Analysis. We have also John Eikenberry. Professor Eikenberry is Albert G. Milbank Professor of Politics and International Affairs at Princeton University in the Department of Politics and the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. Professor Eikenberry has served as a member of an advisory group at the State Department in 2003-2004. As you know, we have had a serious maritime issues in East Asia, but particularly that we had some critical moments over South China Sea, Yellow Sea, as well as East China Sea. You might recall we had Chinese officials starting to talk about core interests, which they regard, which they try to apply it to South China Sea, even though that official line has somewhat been more compromised or revised, I should say, in the subsequent months. Then we had this Cheonan incident in East China, in Yellow Sea, and then it strained the relationship between North Korea and South Korea and the rest of Northeast Asia, and also in an intriguing way, the relationship between China and South Korea and the United States. It was followed by ARF meeting in Hanoi, which was held in July, when the United States and some ASEAN members almost confronted China by arguing that challenging China's long-standing position on that sovereignty and territorial issues. Although that also has been somewhat, that tension receded in later last year and this year. It still remains to be very much thorny issues. In September, we had Senkak shock when the Japanese Coast Guard arrested a Chinese boat captain in what they alleged their territorial waters, which actually caused strong Chinese reaction to Japan. Looked like a diplomatic shock and awe operation on the part of Japan from Japanese eyes. And then we had the Yeoncheon-do incident, again in Yellow Sea. So we have had this a series of crises last year. Is this 2010 sort of aberration, or it's augurs for something in the future? How do we see the implication of this? What does it reveal? And what kind of lessons have we learned from those series of crises? It's often regarded China's new, more aggressive policy on the maritime issues. But at the same time, we should be reminded of the other maritime issues and territorial issues as well, which has been unsettled among many of the areas in that East Asian maritime issues. So China is not alone that to be on the onus. Finally, how we should cope with those challenges, and what kind of process or mechanism we could possibly come up with to deal with those crises, to these problem challenges more effectively. So those are the questions I asked each panelist to focus on, and each panelist has 5 minutes. So first, I would like to ask Satu to make his presentation.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Funabashi-san. And let me again, as others, thank Jeju Forum for this opportunity to be here. You've laid out some of the key sort of events and the context, so I think I'll move straight to the 2 questions you raised, which are what are the lessons learned and how to overcome problems. And on the lessons learned, let me say first that I don't think the lessons come only from what's happened, but I think there are some important lessons from what the reactions have been thus far to what has happened. And I'd make 4 points. First, I'd say that the very difficult situation of the last 18, 19 months on these maritime security issues, which are not unique. I mean, after all, in 2001, there was the EP3 incident in April 2001. But first lesson I draw is that these disputes are manageable. They did not escalate. They did not spill over into other areas of relations. In fact, some of the most serious ones, particularly between the United States and China, raised by the Impeccable incident and the Victorious incident, in fact, led to fairly a set of actions, including a new dialogue on the United Nations Conference of the Law of the Sea. And we can discuss that, but my first point lesson would be manageability. The second is that another lesson I take is that part of the reason they've become manageable is that fairly hardened positions were taken by the U.S. on South China Sea, on the Senkakus, and continuing to carry out planned activities, including reconnaissance activities and others. So in other words, this was not a backing down by the United States of certain fundamentals both on principles and policies. The second is U.S. upped support for its friends and allies in the region, including Japan, which I'll get to. And at the same time, the U.S. continued to keep an open dialogue with the People's Republic of China, including a set of visits like the January 2011 visit by President Hu. As I said, the decision to open talks on UNCLOS in this strategic and economic dialogue, etc. The third lesson I would sort of draw my own assessment on is the U.S. proactive stance, I believe, were critical in leading to a set of rapprochement activities between the U.S. and China. Dai Bingguo's December 2010 article, again, the President Hu visit. And the fourth sort of lesson I draw is that none of this is resolved. All of it is still open. And in fact, some of the consequences are quite unclear about what goes forward on the South China Sea in light of Mrs. Clinton's statement at the July ARF summit, which Funabashi-san referred to, as well as a very important change on U.S. position on the Senkakus, which is that it falls under Article 5 of the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty. And that's a very important change that implicates the United States. And, of course, it's not a fully resolved issue. How to overcome these problems? Again, I'd offer sort of four or five thoughts on this. First, one option is to really see if the United States can even push harder on resolution of South China Sea and Senkakus. My own personal assessment is we can't move further than we have already. The statement by Mrs. Clinton at the July ARF summit was very clear, very detailed, and it's hard to think how we could go beyond it. Same with the Senkakus. The second way to overcome problems is to reduce reconnaissance activities, particularly in the U.S.-China maritime disputes. But this has global implications, principles of freedom of navigation. It would run counter to U.S. policy, and the Taiwan contingency still remains a very important guiding issue that would shape such activities. The third, I think, option is to ratify UNCLOS. And there's a lot of support for this in the United States in terms of the military and defense and diplomatic services. But I think, obviously it hasn't been ratified in the Senate, and I don't anticipate that it will be in the next year or so. But when Mrs. Clinton, for example, made the summit, a statement at the ARF summit, she specifically mentioned ratification of UNCLOS in that context. So that's a third, I think, opportunity for us to help move towards management of these issues. A fourth prospect is moving from the maritime consultative agreement with China, the 1998 agreement, into a more formalized incidents at sea regime. There are advantages and disadvantages. We can perhaps discuss some of the advantages and disadvantages, but that's been raised as an issue. I think that will be very tough negotiating if, in fact, there's going to be any movement on that. And the final sort of way to overcome these problems is the really heightened importance of a strong U.S.-China dialogue. And I think this last few months has indicated an ability to get back on track after a very difficult 18-20 months. So let me conclude there with my time finishing that I think that these problems are not going to go away. I think there are structural reasons to believe that these problems and incidents are going to increase for a whole host of reasons. And more contingencies are likely in the future. But I do think that it's not beyond the scope of management, though resolution will be very difficult. Thank you.
Thank you, Satu. Our next speaker will be John Eikenberry. John.
Thank you very much. My comments are going to echo very much what has already been said, but and I just would say to start with it, I have the same questions that Yoichi posed at the beginning. I too am wanting to hear about the lessons learned from 2010, because it was a year when a great deal occurred in the region, particularly in maritime conflict between China and its neighbors, and the questions about what China learns from what occurred this year and what happens in terms of the diplomacy, regional diplomacy of maritime security and conflict. What kinds of creative ideas can come out of it? Those, for me, are the big questions. But let me just make a few points. First, it seems to me that when we think about China's rise and U.S. conflict with China, the maritime realm is where we are going to see a lot of the conflict in the first phase, let's say, of this power transition that we're watching. It's clearly a microcosm of the region and the nature of the conflict between China and the United States and American allies. China wants to expand its naval presence. It has commercial stakes in the sea lanes and their protection. It has an ambitious military modernization and naval modernization program. It wants to project its influence and assert itself in the region, particularly in the context of island territorial disputes and resources that are undersea. The U.S. on the other side wants to protect its maritime preeminence, and it wants to, and this is important, signal its reliability as a security provider in the region. So it has, certainly the Obama administration has come into office wanting to enhance the imagery of the United States as an Asian power, that it's returned, that it's back, as Secretary Clinton said, or as President Obama said, we are an Asian great power. There is an effort for the U.S. to send signals to allies that it is a reliable, credible partner, and it will be there when specific disputes arise. So we saw this really in action in 2010, and as I said in an earlier panel, 2010 is going to be one of the years that we will be thinking about for a long, long time to come, assessing what went on. When I'm in Beijing, the questions were, why did the United States change its behavior in 2010? Why did it start to assert itself in ways that it hadn't seemed to assert itself, to use rhetoric, the national interest that the U.S. has in, as Secretary Clinton said, in the region, in terms of the outcome of these territorial disputes and the offer to mediate these disputes. And on the American side, the question of China, what changed in China? We thought that there was this brilliant diplomacy that had marked really the period of 10 or 15 years of very careful efforts to signal restraint and accommodation and bending, if you will, with the geopolitical realities of the region. So we have these dual imperatives that seem playing themselves out. Secretary Clinton in Hanoi, as we said earlier, asserting American interests and signaling its willingness and eagerness to work with ASEAN, and China wanting to once again as well assert its own claims and offer a kind of expansive notion of its own territorial claims. It seems to me that this is a recipe for ongoing conflict, and that it is structural in a very real sense. And the lessons, it seems to me, are several. On the Chinese side, I would hope that the central lesson is that there is a problem in its expansive and some would say aggressive definition of its interests in the region, and the shall we say evolutionary redefinition of the law of the sea treaty in terms of rights, and so there is a potential, as I think Hanoi in July suggested, of a concerted backlash against that behavior. And so the lesson for China should be that there should be an incentive to put these disputes in multilateral fora, to work on conflict resolution mechanisms in the face of particular crises. And on the United States side, it seems to be the question of whether the steps that were taken in 2010 are sustainable. The Hanoi diplomacy of Secretary Clinton, the question really there is, was that a kind of one-shot deal where it was kind of exhilarating, but not really a position that can be sustained over the long term, kind of like when a young child who goes down a slide for the first time, it's sort of like, wow, that was exciting. Well, do you want to do it again? No, not really. So was this a kind of a moment that really was very unique and not really sustainable or not? It seems to me the much more long-term sort of challenge is for these maritime disputes and potential for more to be put into the kind of agenda that we all think has to be pushed. over the next few years of strengthening, providing more coherence to a regional security structure more generally for handling we'll call it the U.S.-Chinese power transition. Diplomatic efforts to make security and military doctrines and strategies transparent, regular mill-to-mill dialogues, the search for a region-wide security mechanism to handle disputes, and long-term measures by China and the United States to find ways to signal restraint, accommodation, and assurances that these disputes will not spiral. Those larger and longer term challenges, it seems to me, are ultimately the only solution, if you will, for what is a difficult and certainly going to be repeated problem of disputes over maritime territory and security. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Our next speaker will be Professor Yan Xuetong. Xuetong, it's your turn.
Thank you, Chairman. And I'm concerned that the maritime issue is, in most cases, a combination of the conflicts of economic interests and the conflicts between the sovereignty claims. So since it is a combination of both economic and the sovereignty, and make these things are always very difficult to settle down. And generally speaking, I think it's relatively easier to settle down economic disputes rather than the sovereignty disputes. So that's why, and Deng Xiaoping once suggested, let's shelve the sovereignty issue or conflicts, and then just looking for the common approach to do the economic development. So I think that's because concerning the fishing, about concerning exploit the fossil energy, or even the other economic interests in the sea, it's not that difficult because it's just an issue of money. And the money issue is always negotiable and manageable, and just talking about how to divide the money. But come to the sovereignty issue, it becomes a zero-sum game, and it's difficult. It cannot solve this problem with the approach dealing with the economic conflicts. So the positive part for the maritime conflicts in this region is that there's no danger of the war. I cannot see any maritime conflicts will lead to war in this region in visible future, and because this, although there's many maritime conflicts, and like Japan has territory disputes with Russia, with Korea, with China, and North Korea and South Korea has territory disputes and in this region. And we have problem with Vietnam, but many countries have this maritime problem in this region, but none of them at this moment and is possible to bring any military clashes in this region. So that's a positive part. The negative part is that it's difficult to find a solution to solve the problem. So from my understanding, the precondition for settle down territory disputes is a political relationship. When you have a better political relationship, although we call it a strategic friendship, and then it's not that difficult to find a solution for the border disputes or the territory disputes, like we experienced with our other land border countries, with Russia, with Myanmar, with even with Vietnam on the land border disputes. So you need a kind of a political friendship or political confidence as the precondition to settle down the border disputes. And unfortunately, it seems to me, we don't have this kind of condition for settle down the maritime territory disputes. So what we can do, seems to me, the approach to solve at this moment, the approach is not looking for how to settle down these disputes, but how to prevent conflicts caused by these disputes. What we learned from the last year, I think we should lower down the goal from the settle down or solve the problem, rather than go to the more realistic goal to prevent conflicts and resulted from the differences. And that's one way. One approach. The other thing we should consider is that maybe we can considering to looking for some agreements to divide the economic interests, because that's possible, relatively easier. So we should separate the economic conflicts from the territory disputes, and that make this issue relatively easy to get some agreements. And the last thing, from my understanding, is that we need to have a less country to involved. Just John has mentioned that Hillary talking about the represents in Asia, and from my understanding, that a kind of stimulus to the Chinese response. And so if that seems to me the more American involved in these issues, and it becomes more difficult, and sometimes get more troubles. And so I think we have a less country involved in these conflicts, and make it relatively easy to solve the problem. Definitely, the people from the ASEAN country may say that, okay, because you're strong, we're weak, we certainly want to deal with you at a multilateral framework, because we can use a collective effort to dealing with you. That's understandable. But then, that doesn't mean that that approach can solve the problem. That doesn't mean that if you put this issue on the multilateral table, you can settle down the problem, or you can gain anything. Except you make these things more difficult and make it unsolvable, and I don't think anyone can get anything. If we want to prevent new conflicts or escalation of conflicts from these disputes, and we need to looking for more constructive way to solve the problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Our last speaker will be Professor Park Jin-hyun.
Thank you. I'd like to start my comment by saying that what I'm saying is my personal observations. Before I talk about the concerns, lessons to be learned from what happened last year, and any specific suggestion to improve situation here, let me just briefly talk about background. These problems are not new problems. If you know the history of this region, some of maritime disputes really go back to almost 1,000 years ago. When Korea normalized relation with Japan in 1965, the most difficult issue between two countries was fishery agreement. So maritime issue in this part of the world has always been a very difficult issue, and maritime security has always been a important security concern, important regional security concern. So in that sense, it's not surprising that we have had tension over maritime issue in this part of the world. That being said, however, what happened last year was extraordinary in terms of those tensions rose here and there in a series of row, crisis, or whatever. That was extraordinary. Another concern many have with respect to last year's series of events was particular context in which this event unfolded, especially in the context of, say, rise of China, maybe rising tension between the United States and China, and so on. So in two aspects, what happened last year was different from previous occasion. But if you look at the longer perspective, I think this has been a kind of latest version of ongoing tension over maritime issues in East Asia. We have had ups and downs, of course, in the past, and this is the kind of latest up in the ongoing tension over this issue. What lesson we can learn? I think perhaps the most important lesson we can learn is we should really take this issue seriously. This is a really issue that needs to be managed. This is an area for conflict management and preventive diplomacy and cooperative approach to reduce tension and so on. So I think we should take this issue seriously. Unless we manage this issue, this conflict very well, we might have deterioration of situation and so on. Here in Northeast Asia, we have a summit meeting among three countries, Korea, Japan, and China. In fact, we had this latest summit last week, a few days ago. I don't know, it is the fourth or fifth summit. 2 years ago, three countries agree on the measure to be considered by three countries, about 20 measures. I always think that maritime cooperation should be given priority as an agenda for this Northeast Asia summit. But I never heard the maritime issue have been included as an agenda for this summit. Here in this part of the world, there is tendency to consider maritime issue as a kind of low politics issues where high politician should not be that much concerned with and so on. But as I mentioned, if you look at the history of this region, there has been, in fact, this issue have been a source of cause of tension and conflict for a long time. So we better take this issue very seriously. What specific suggestion I can make? I can make a few suggestions. Number one, I think it's very important for regional country to increase openness and transparency about their maritime practice and policy. In fact, we don't know much about maritime practice of some key countries in this region. We don't know much about, for example, North Korea's baseline. But North Korea, it's not surprising that we don't know much about North Korea. But on the other hand, we don't know much about China's famous so-called 9 dotted line in South China Sea. In fact, I have asked my Chinese colleagues on many occasions, but I didn't get answer on this issue. So obviously, I hope regional countries should increase, should let their maritime practice know, so that we don't have unnecessary misunderstanding or distrust among ourselves. So that is very important. The second I can suggest is obviously we need CBM's confidence building measure among countries. There has been some progress on this front, especially bilateral CBMs have been underway between some key countries. But I think there should be more efforts to introduce confidence building measure SC by key regional countries. Third suggestion I can make is, if you look at the serious, many maritime conflict disputes, they have a strong legal dimension. You listen to Secretary Clinton talking about the legitimate claims comes from legitimacy in law. China talking about their claims are based on law of sea, international law. We are talking about the UN Convention on the Law of Sea. By the way, most countries in this region are parties to UN Convention on the Law of Sea. If you look at the UN Convention on the Law of Sea, this is the most comprehensively codified part of international law. And UN Convention provides state parties with very effective dispute settlement mechanism. It is there for state party to utilize. I'm not here to promote my tribunal, but my tribunal is ready to deal with any cases. Some people say Asian countries are reluctant to submit their dispute to international adjudication. That used to be true, but it is no longer the case. Many Asian countries submit their dispute to international adjudication. And in fact, Japan appeared 3 times before my tribunal. And Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia resolved their territorial dispute by submitting their dispute to International Court of Justice. And also Singapore and Malaysia submitted their very controversial land reclamation project to our tribunal. So Asian countries start to make use of this international adjudication as a means to settle their dispute. I think many of these disputes, not all of them, but many of these disputes are very amenable to judicial settlement. So regional countries really need to think about whether they can take advantage of this very effective dispute settlement mechanism provided for by the UN Convention on the Law of Sea. Finally, already previous speakers talked about this sovereignty issue and economic issue. I think I agree with what has been said. I think countries in this part of the world need to separate this economic issue or functional issue from territorial or jurisdictional issues. This territorial issue, jurisdictional issue are very, very difficult, if not impossible, to be resolved. On the other hand, economic issue or resource issue are very pressing issue. Also environmental issue, very pressing. It's really daily events. Therefore, regional countries need to probably have a mindset whereby you separate this functional issue from territorial or boundary issue. We can have many creative arrangements to utilize resources without really touching upon underlying sovereignty or jurisdictional issue. With that, I stop here. Thank you.
Well, Professor Park, thank you very much. Particularly, thank you for your illuminating many points. It's a very, very authoritative voice. Thank you. Let me ask each panelist one question for each. To Xuetong, I'd like to ask you this question. What did China actually learn from that last year's series of crises? Is there any new interest emerging within Chinese policy community in, say, bringing some of the issues, maritime issues, to, say, maritime tribunal? Or, but anyway, what is that? What is your take with regard to the China lesson for China?
Well, I really don't know what our government learned from the last year's all these events. But I think there's a lot of discussion on the media and talking about what we should do about these maritime disputes. I think, generally speaking, I think there's two groups, and some people concern this economic issue. So we should go back to who insist on the Deng Xiaoping's policy, shelve the territory disputes, and shelve the sovereignty disputes, and then go looking for the opportunity to develop the what the term is common development, looking for a common development. The other group argue that this policy has carried out for several decades, and I think that this policy actually was adopted for normalize our relationship with Japan, and at that time this policy effectively and moved away the political obstacle for China and Japan normalize our relationship. And then people say that now why this policy no longer works, and then some people argue that now to carry out the principle of a shelf disputes for common development have to based on common agreements between two sides. If there's no bilateral agreements, and this principle won't work. That means any sides, if it do not carry out this principle, you cannot make the principle to govern the both sides action, and then the conflicts will come. So the other group argue that now if we want to insist on this principle, we'll have to work with our neighbors and to get their promise that they agree.
Let me start with the President.
If they do not agree with this principle, there's no way to carry out, to implement or to practice this. So I think this the debate, what I observe in China. Generally speaking, I think what happened last year is that most of the countries already, surrounding countries, our surrounding countries, no longer.
What kind of student do you want to produce?
They want China to practice
what kind of faculty members
this principle unilaterally, create? But they don't.
In the coming
so that's
50
why
years.
It happened. So this morning we're talking about the China threat, and then you find that when usually the country to complain or define the other side as a threat. The U.S. define the North Korea and the Iran as a threat, and Iran and North Korea define the U.S. as a threat. But the China's case is very interesting. We never define anyone as a threat to China, but we're defined as a threat by everyone. So what happened? So from my understanding, actually, we continue to practice this principle of shelf the sovereignty disputes for common development. Unfortunately, when the other countries to give up that principle, the principle doesn't work. Thank you.
Thank you, Shetan. I think one background of the tension over the maritime issues, which was so pronounced last year, was impeccable crisis in the previous year, 2009, between the U.S. and China. So the relationship between U.S. and China actually, I think, played a significant role in setting the stage for this. I'm wondering how that China's military new interests in anti-access area denial, in which China has now made a strenuous effort to make that first island chain for this anti-access area has something. I think it has something to do with this tension between China and the United States, as well as Japan, particularly. But my question goes to Satu. How do you see this China's newly interest, a new interest in new military doctrine, and its implication for that maritime issues in that East Asian waters.
That means we need to provide.
Thank you. Well, I mean, I think that certainly doctrines like anti-access or area denial are part of the picture. But, you know, I don't think they're the only part of the picture, because as I said in my opening remarks, clearly, and I would agree very much with John Eikenberry on this, and I said that this reflects both sovereignty issues but also shifts in power. And so the new doctrines of anti-access or area denial occur within a context of shifts in the balance of power. So that's part of it. It's also part of it that there are still unresolved disputes between the United States and China, the potential for a contingency. And even deeper than that, on Taiwan, for example, but even deeper than that is that the U.S. and China simply have different understandings and fundamental disagreements about what kinds of activities are allowed in the EEZ. And so I don't foresee any chance of early resolution of those differences. I mean, I think the U.S. is very clear under UNCLOS what activities are allowed and by customary practice. China has a different view based on domestic law and its reading of UNCLOS. And so I think that these kinds of incidents like Impeccable, like the Victorious, earlier on air reconnaissance and EP3, as I mentioned 10 years ago,
do you have in mind?
This is part of a pattern. So I don't think it's
has given the mandate of
ascribed to one thing, but rather these deeper shifts in the balance of
have
power.
In mind?
Clearly a more active, more outward-looking Chinese out-and-about Navy, and then these underlying differences of principle and policy that are going to require the U.S. to undertake activities that we've been doing for a very long time and are likely to continue doing for all the reasons I stated. And that's why we have to work very hard with our Chinese colleagues. And this I would agree with Shuteng, that the relationship matters a lot in how we manage these disagreements.
In terms of, let's say,
Professor Park, China has regarded the United States' involvement in the South China Sea issues as a sort of irrelevant. The irrelevant party should not get involved, according to one Chinese spokesperson's statement. Xue Dong also mentioned on this in his remarks. On the other hand, Secretary Clinton made a very clear statement saying that the United States is interested in playing a facilitator role in diffusing the crisis and helping that concerned parties reach some consensus on that issues. How do we really see that the U.S. role here? In what way the United States role is legitimate or should be seen legitimate? From your judge's perspective, what are the issues here?
Thank you. Before answering your question, if you allow me, let me just touch upon previous question you raised. There are many maritime problems, issues in East Asia, from island dispute, boundary problem, resource problems, fishery issues, piracy, and environmental degradations, marine scientific research, intelligence gathering, naval exercise, many issues. And with respect to those issues, I don't think there is a kind of China versus rest of Asia or China versus United States structure. In fact, for example, Korea agree with China on many issues vis-a-vis Japan. In fact, Korea and China protested against Japan's claim to continental shelf around Okinawa-Torishima. And also, if you look at the Spratly Islands, there have been overlap of claims by many countries among Southeast Asian
Professor
states.
Evans,
So,
let me raise one question.
I don't think it's true that
made a very
China
interesting point.
is
We
one
all
side
Asian university wanted to
and the rest of
internationalize.
Asia
And we all wanted to enjoy
the other
surplus
side
in
with respect
educational
to all
balance
these
of payments.
disputes. Really,
We have a more foreign
it differs
students,
from
but you
one
said
issue
that Australia,
to another.
education in Australia is the
That's
third
one
largest
point I like
export
to
industry.
mention. And
But
another
Vietnam,
is
Japan,
after
South Korea,
a series
China,
of
we
events
all wanted
last
to
year,
have university
I
which
don't know
can
what
have
lesson
more
China
foreign
learned.
students.
That's
What do you
not
see the
something
trend
I
there?
can
What would be the Australian
I can
strategy
say. But
to overcome that dilemma?
Now, China and Southeast Asian countries get together again to talk about South China Sea. So obviously, China no longer say that South China Sea is its core interest. So obviously, there has been change of tone, rhetoric with respect to at least South China Sea. In fact, China has been very helpful in dealing with South China Sea in the 1990s when this South China Sea workshop was held regularly in adopting the code of conduct over South China Sea and so on. So that's what I want to point out. And with respect to your question, what was that?
The country can lose its
U.S. role. Mediation is, according to textbook, is a voluntary form of conflict management by third party, which means that if one party is not willing or prepared to accept the offer of mediation by third party,
우리
this
제주대학도
mediation
그렇게
may not go
세계적인
on
명문대학이
smoothly. So
될 수 있다고
obviously here
보십니까?
important party to this South China Sea dispute is China, and China seems to be very reluctant to China is very negative about the United States playing a mediator role in this dispute. So I don't know how United States can be an effective mediator in this dispute. That being said, of course, the United States has legitimate interest in securing navigation rights in South China Sea, as long as there is high sea or exclusive economic zone and so on. So obviously, the United States has, like any other countries, has a right to protect its rights to say what it wants to say with respect to what it considers legitimate rights of the United States. Thank you.
Thank you very much. John, Secretary Clinton told the ARF partners in Hanoi that the United States ratification of UNCLOS is a priority. The United States is not a party has not ratified yet. Do you think that it has really weakened the U.S. position vis-a-vis China as well as the other countries in East Asia on this issue? And do you think that the United States is going to ratify the UNCLOS in the foreseeable future?
Well, that's a great question, and I did say in my remarks that I thought that the U.S. position would be strengthened by ratification, and that the law of the sea provides the kind of legal infrastructure for adjudicating so many of these conflicts, and so it's right there, and so many parties have, as been already mentioned, ratified and are party to it, and the U.S. should become. The question is, will it? And there, it's a very inhospitable environment in Washington for treaty ratification, even the most sensible and straightforward. But what is interesting about this one is that there are allies, so to speak, in the U.S. military who see this as terribly important, and it's not the usual left-right or Democrat-Republican, liberal-Jacksonian kind of splits. There's a constituency here that would be seen as potentially favorable for some action. I can't say what the prospects are in the short term, but it has so much value, I think, to the United States, and some of the older reservations relating to deep sea mining have disappeared. So it seems to me that there is the correlation of forces favor it in the longer term, and I think it fits with the Obama administration's general grand strategy, both globally and in Asia, of strengthening its position by asserting its willingness to work within multilateral frameworks. It's the kind of engagement logic that Obama has spoken of time and time again in engaging ASEAN and the Treaty on Amity and Cooperation. It fits very, very nicely within the scheme, I think, that Obama has laid out, and Secretary Clinton as well, for the U.S. to have a kind of staying presence in the region. Again, I can tell you all sorts of stories about American domestic politics, and there's no certainty when it comes to even sound policy and treaties, but it is a strategic interest of the United States. So I think that at least allows us to hope.
Thank you, John. Sheton, you indicated that a critical need to for us to come up with effective mechanism for East Asian maritime security. Would you kindly elaborate a little bit further? Would you be more specific on this?
Well, actually, at this moment, from my understanding, we don't have this, although there's a lot of talk about the common development, but actually we have not seen any concrete common development agreements. And so I think we need to have this bureaucracy people to sit together to talking about how to develop the things. And one thing make the things change continuously is the development of the technology. When we can only drill the 800 under the water, that's one thing. And then before they reach an agreement, or even after they reach agreement about how to deal with the shelf, the content shelf, and then the new technology can drill the 2,000 meters. Now it's a move over 3,000 meters. So that means that before we have that technology, and you do not need any agreement anyhow, because no one can drill anything from that part. But when the technology comes, they have to talk about, hey, wait a minute, you cannot set up your drill there, and that's my shelf. So from my understanding, at this moment, we need to have some kind of ad hoc group or committee to talking about this shelf. And it's not talking about how to divide the shelf, but it's talking about when we have new technology, how can we have a joint venture? Okay, how much we should count as a technology, and how much count if it's closer to my parts. So I think that if they discuss this issue from the economic perspective, it's very possible for these countries to reach some agreement to divide these natural resources. But unfortunately, they always related to this kind of discussion with the sovereignty. And then they blocked any agreements on that. So specifically, I think we need some ad hoc committee and, I don't know, either bilateral or multilateral, talking about how to deal with this natural resources rather than sovereignty.
Professor Park, how do you respond to that?
Well, I think I absolutely agree with what has been said. We better listen to Deng Xiaoping when he said we should postpone this matter to the future generation. That's what I said about separation of functional issue from territorial or jurisdictional issues. Obviously, it is extremely difficult if you are realistic. It's extremely difficult to resolve this territorial issue. On the other hand, this resource development is a rather pressing issues. Then how can we approach this? We separate territorial issue from resource issue. I think it can be done, and in fact, in this part of the world, Korea and Japan did this a long time ago in the 1970s. Korea and Japan agreed on joint development of oil and gas in East China Sea. That was, in fact, the first joint development agreement of this kind in the history of the world. So we were kind of creative in dealing with those problems already in 1970s. So why not in 21st century? I think we can come up with a lot more creative arrangement. Cooperate creative arrangement to develop these resources that straddle this boundary, common deposits, and so on. So I agree with what has been said.
Just add one concrete issue. Very recently, and the Vietnamese fishermen complained, and they are arrested by our the maritime petroleum guards. And the reason is that according to our new law, and we prevent the overfishing because many fish already disappear in the sea. So they said, okay, according to this, create a better relationship with the environment. So we can we issue the law, and sometimes are forbidden fishing, and then so we can control the Chinese fishermen. If they're fishing during that period, they will be arrested. But then the Vietnamese fishing boats come in. They don't have the law. In Vietnam, they don't have the law to protect the sea. And the fishermen can fishing at any time. So they said, hey, we have the right to fishing here. We said, you have the right, but now this period. And then there's becomes a political dispute. So I think now, along with the technology, even the fishing technology, there's a capability so huge. They can clean the water. They can fish every fish and leave nothing in it. So you see, and now according to the progress of technology, we need some committee to work on this.
Satu, how do you see the Indian Ocean come into play here? Do you see any spillover effects from this East Asian maritime issues over the Indian Ocean? I'm very much interested in your view.
Well, the general principles that the U.S. holds to, freedom of navigation, EEZ policy, transit, etc., would apply. The one thing I would make the point about the Indian Ocean, which I think is a spillover from what might be called, the Western Pacific or East Asia focus, is that increasingly in the United States, this maritime commons area is seen as part of a whole, in a way that, well, let's say for much of the Cold War, most Americans, we didn't see the connection. But now, and the reasons are structural and very obvious. I mean, much of Asia's expanded trade across the Indian Ocean from East Asia, energy imports, the fact that Chinese are involved in counter-piracy activities in the Indian Ocean, the fact that other countries in Asia have been active in the Indian Ocean. So all of this is creating a kind of strategic contraction across the maritime commons. So on the good side, it's bringing this all as part of a whole knit package. On the slightly, if you want to be slightly more pessimistic, it raises another area where ships are likely to encounter each other, submarine ships, airplanes. So it kind of expands the area in which unplanned encounters could occur, where disagreements could occur. But that's how I would cast the Indian Ocean context.
This is my last question. I'd like to ask this question to Professor Pak again. There seems to emerge some consensus among the parties that code of conduct, which is basically just a declaration, has to be formalized, and preferably with some enforcement authority. How realistic do you think of this recommendations? What will be the toughest part of formalizing the current code of conduct into the more formalized one?
I don't know exactly what is underway, but formalizing code of conduct may carry a little more normative weight as a formal treaty or convention. But I'm wondering whether it is realistic to expect that we have a treaty with sanction against those who fail to comply with this code of conduct, given what we know about Southeast Asia and the way they do business, the way they deal with these problems, their consensual approach, their preference for more dialogue, and so on. I don't know whether such an intrusive form of formal code of conduct with possible sanction against non-compliant is really a realistic possibility in the near future. Obviously, if it can be done, I think that's probably development for more effective ocean regime in this part of the world.
Well, thank you very much. I think the session has been very much educational, at least for me, and it's really the best public discourse, and I really appreciate all the panelists sharing their wisdom with us. I really have felt strongly now after hearing this that even though this crisis would not perhaps develop into the major military conflicts, but still that the maritime concerns in that most of all that seafaring nations actually have caused that a huge military arms race, military build-up. And so military build-up will very much likely strain the relationship in the coming years. So we cannot be complacent of the situation. Also, many panelists also pointed out that this is all about power and sovereignty, particular sovereignty issues, and given that potentially explosive nature, it could easily stoke that nationalism. And it would be extremely difficult for any political authorities to control and manage that nationalism once it's erupted. So again, we should not be complacent about this. Finally, I think that we have been confronted with that enormous gap between that economic integration among that East Asian countries on the one hand, and that almost the anarchic with law of the jungle in managing that maritime issues on the other hand. And I think that we really have to fill this gap. So with that remarks, I would like to close the session, and please join me thanking for the panelists. Thank you very much.